Well, good afternoon. As Stacy said, my name is Dan Verton. I'm the executive editor of Meritalk, and welcome to the first ever Big Data Brainstorm debate. And the gentlemen that we have assembled here have promised to engage us in a lively discussion, mental combat over the issues of big data and ethical use of big data. Let me introduce our panelists for this afternoon. To my far left is Mr. Stewart Baker. Stewart is a partner with Steptoe & Johnson, LLP, and is a former general counsel for the National Security Agency. To my immediate left is Mr. Marc Rotenberg, and Marc is the president and executive director of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. So we've heard a lot of great things about big data and analytics today, about how it's really changing our world. It's changing the way our governments operate. It's changing our government's relationship with citizens. It's changing how we go about our daily lives. And it's having significant positive impact in many respects. But we're going to explore a different question today. A central question is going to be, just because agencies and private organizations can do certain things with big data and analytics, should they? And that's where I want to engage our two experts today. And I want to start off, Stewart and Marc, obviously with one of the big issues that is top of mind today is obviously the attacks in Paris recently, the ongoing threat of terrorism, and the debate that's taking place in the building behind us, which is the issue over vetting of Syrian immigrants and the dangers posed by groups like ISIL and others infiltrating those flows of refugees. And this is really interesting because it is a big data question because we don't have a lot of data on a lot of these folks.
And so I'd like to get a small data problem then.
Well, yeah, it's a small data problem. Good point. So I'd like to get both of your perspectives on one, the security issues involved here, and how do we go about getting the data so that we feel comfortable with it. And maybe, Marc, you could also talk about some of the privacy issues involved in this. Stewart, let's start with you.
Sure, and thanks for having me here. I had a friend 15 years ago who used to say, just because you can doesn't mean you should. He called it the spandex rule. Which I thought got it about right. But on your question about what can you do with data and vetting refugees, when I was at DHS, this was a big problem for us. We had to take in a lot of Iraqi refugees, tens of thousands a year, and were very concerned about terrorists who might be hiding among them, or people coming from visa waiver countries who just up and come. They didn't have to make a reservation with us. They just made a reservation with the airline. And so we brought to bear some big data capabilities against particularly the visa waiver travelers, essentially saying, from now on, make a reservation with us too. Get online. Tell us you're coming, and we'll tell you whether that's okay or not. We had to negotiate that with the Europeans, because everything has to be negotiated with the Europeans. They called it an electronic visa, and we said, oh, no, it's just electronic and it's like a visa, but it's not a visa. What we did behind that is we took all of that data, the people who said they were coming, and we ran it against all the databases that we were aware of that might indicate terrorist problems. We negotiated with a bunch of European countries to give us their criminal databases so that we would know whether this person was a criminal. Remarkably, people could come here and we would never know they were criminals when they crossed the border without these agreements. And all of those were tools that allowed us to do a better job of deciding not who to let in, but who to interview, because you only have, probably you can interview one person out of 100. And so as a tool for narrowing down, as opposed to punishing people, narrowing down the people you're going to scrutinize, our data worked reasonably well. I don't think most of that will work for refugees because you have no real data about them. They come from places where where you can't trust the government to give you straight data. The documents they produce are likely to be forged. All you really have are fingerprints, and that's not enough to do a great job of screening.
Now, Mark, you talk about the potential, particularly when we talk about Department of Homeland Security, their current operations of deciding who gets to go to secondary screening, as an example. The potential for big data to lead to broader discrimination in other areas. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So let me begin by saying that I don't think privacy groups and people who favor greater security are in much disagreement over the objective of keeping the nation safe and secure. I think where we disagree sometimes are what the requirements are. And when we talk about privacy, for example, we're not simply talking about limiting how much personal information the government may get access to, but also we're concerned about the transparency and use of the data it obtains. Because one of the very real problems in the big data world is that mistakes are very easily made. In fact, the argument could be made that the opportunity for mistakes in the big data environment increase almost exponentially as more data is gathered. Now, that's not an argument against gathering data, but it is an argument for saying that there has to be some basis of accountability. If, for example, you're turned down for a loan because the bank doesn't have complete information about you or confused you with another customer or any number of other problems that might have led to a determination that's not based on fact, fortunately, the Fair Credit Reporting Act gives you the opportunity to actually say to the bank, what was the basis of that determination? I mean, you have the right to turn people down for loans, but let's at least make sure that the information you're relying on is accurate and correct. Now, this takes us back to the example with passenger screening. One of the issues that EPIC has been very interested in over the years is how does the government make determinations about people? Again, it's not that you can't exclude people from the country, and it's not that you can't pull them aside and ask them some more questions, but why are you doing it, right? And we have a Freedom of Information Act request, actually a case against the TSA, in which we were able to uncover a protocol that said when when the agency is looking at people waiting for planes at airports, they can make a determination based on, among other factors, a person's nationality or a person's race. Now, that to me is interesting, I mean, Stewart might say, well, if the person is Syrian, maybe it's a good thing that we're pulling them aside. I would be careful about those judgments. If we're doing it based purely on race, because they're Hispanic or African American, I would say the Constitution probably doesn't allow that. But either way, when those determinations are made in the big data environment, paradoxically, privacy people are oftentimes arguing for more transparency.
Now, Stewart, I understand that you actually believe if we're not looking at certain aspects of passengers and screening, then we're not really doing our job.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not there aren't a lot of Finns blowing up planes, and you need to worry about people who are coming from places or backgrounds that make them susceptible to the messages that ISIS is preaching, and that doesn't mean you say, okay, you come from this country, so you're just out of luck. But when you're trying to decide how am I going to use my scarce resources, I can interview 4 of these 100 people, you might make the judgment based on where they're from. And I assume, if you're worried about Boko Haram, you might say, we're going to look at Africans, and that no one would say that that was unconstitutional.
Rebuttal?
Well, I think it could well be if the category says simply race and, it says black, and you say, okay, you correspond to that characteristic in our profile, and therefore we have a basis to take you aside and ask you questions. I think it's a slightly more difficult call with nationality, but of course now we're in the midst of this very interesting debate, which is to what extent do we want to ascribe to the people who are actually leaving the area of all this terrible turmoil and destruction, trying to obtain freedom, the intent of the rulers that they're trying to escape from, right? I mean, that's the very odd thing about the pushback on the refugees today. People imagine that there's an alliance between those who are trying to leave the country and those who rule the country. It's almost certainly the case that in the 99.99% of circumstances, the exact opposite is true. Now, of course, we have the literal needle in the haystack problem, because it could well be that in that great flood, there are a few people that intend some harm. But from a statistical perspective, I would actually say for the vast majority of people, the opposite inference would be the right one to draw.
Well, I'm not quite sure that's true in Syria, since the people who are fighting the government hate us as much as the people who are fighting for the government. And it's a very limited group of people who dislike both ISIS and the government and like us. So I'm not quite sure that I buy your premise, but I certainly agree that this is a problem of finding a needle in a haystack. And in some ways, the more data you have, the better in this context, particularly where ultimately the decision that's being made is not yes or no, but will we investigate this person further? Will we use actual human resources to ask people about the things that got them flagged in the first place? If we called that judicial or an administrative hearing right there in the airport, I would have thought that people like Epic would be saying, oh, great, you get a judicial redress right away, or at least quasi-judicial redress. But that is exactly what is going on in most of these contexts. You take as much data as you can, you dump it in, you use it to prioritize your interviews or your investigations, and at the end of the day, there's a human being making a judgment about a person, but he is aided in deciding how to use his resources by all the relevant data that you've been able to pull together.
I want to explore the question of, is it possible to make meaningful use of big data in a way that's still minimally invasive? Mark, you have an example you use of the Census Bureau.
Right.
Stewart has some different thoughts on the Census Bureau. Why don't you give us that?
Again, there's always a tendency to imagine that, privacy people are against technology, they're against progress, they're against electricity, indoor plumbing. It's kind of a long list of things privacy people are supposed to be against. But in fact, I think some of the most innovative work right now around technology basically tries to solve the problem of how do you take advantage of a new internet-based service and protect privacy, right? So a starting point, a way to think about that is the U.S. Census. And the U.S. Census is very helpful in this regard. We gather lots and lots of detailed personal information from households all across the country, and then we aggregate it. And we're able, looking at sets, to infer wealth by region, housing, education, economic distribution. There's a tremendous amount of information that we obtain from the census that makes us more informed as a country, literally apportioning Congress, among other things we do, with essentially no risk to privacy, right? I mean, at least in theory. Now, of course, there are few well-known exceptions. One was the use of census data during the Second World War to identify Japanese living in California. And another, which was actually a case that we brought after 9/11, when the Census Bureau, Department of Homeland Security, went to the Census Bureau and obtained information about Muslims, regional breakdowns within the United States, and I think particularly in Michigan, which was very interesting and led to a lot of concern about the Census Bureau, But I think the larger point is that census, at least in theory, provides for us a very good example of how, in fact, we can make use of lots of data, make it valuable, not have our hands tied, as people sometimes say, but also respect privacy. Now, making that work in a digital environment turns out to be a hard problem. It's an interesting problem, and it's one that's attracted a lot of the world's leading cryptographers, because they're basically saying, if we've got this big data set that's essentially secret, because we don't want to reveal those individual records, what techniques can we use to access that data set so we only get the necessary information while minimizing privacy risk? And I think that's just a great area to continue to explore.
Yeah, it's probably a waste of money and time, actually. This is a homomorphic
This is why it's a debate.
encryption. The assumption is everybody wants this controlled data and will pay massively to be reassured that privacy has been protected in the course of looking at this data. But all of the indications are that most people want the quickest possible answer that they can get, and they want to work with the companies that can give them the quickest possible answer. And if you say, well, we could give it to you quick, or we could do this fancy homomorphic encryption and process it, and it'll take another 3 weeks and cost you 5 times as much, very few people are going to want to do that. And it's protecting against a very theoretical risk. I think we would be better off saying we're going to use big data tools and techniques to audit the folks who have access to that information to see what they're accessing, and if they are accessing this data in a fashion that suggests abuse, we'll be able to use big data to find the abuses. I think that's probably a much more effective use of existing technology than this cryptographic toy.
So 2 points. One, I want to know who's going to audit the auditors that are locating the abuse. It's kind of a turtles down problem there you've got. But on the other point, last week, in fact, Stewart and I were debating a related issue concerning the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, CISA. And the premise of CISA is that U.S. companies should make available to the government more information about cybersecurity threats. Now, what that means in practice is more of the details provided by their internet connectivity, the website hits and email communications and so on that might otherwise be protected under federal privacy law. The way the CISA deal works is that the companies agree to scrub the personally identifiable information, leaving in place, presumably for the government, the data it needs to track down cybersecurity threats. Now, Stewart, that bill is premised on the belief that it's possible to do exactly what you just said a moment ago is a waste of money. My question is, if that is really the view of the lawmakers, does that mean the cornerstone of that bill has just been knocked out?
No, I think it's a realpolitik compromise reached. The privacy laws that you refer to are utterly inconsistent with a modern world. That the notion is you should only share information about cyber attacks with the government after you see a subpoena. But we all know that you need to see this information. You need to know this is a piece of malware that's inbound to you. This is an IP address that is exfiltrating data. You need to make sure you're not connecting to that IP address. You need to know that right now. As soon as one person finds it, they need to share it with everybody, including the government. And saying, oh yeah, I'll be glad to give it to the government as soon as I see the subpoena is simply saying, why don't we let the government be attacked over and over again while they're going out to get subpoena after subpoena after subpoena. It made no sense to keep that old privacy doctrine in place, but the privacy groups, unfortunately, take the view that you can never get rid of a privacy provision, no matter how stupid it is. And so they mounted a major privacy attack on this bill, claiming that it was going to result in large amounts of private data being given to the government. And in order to satisfy that concern, the law does say that the information should not be stripped of all personal information, but personal information that doesn't have any cybersecurity value, which means that if it's an IP address that's associated with somebody, but it's also being used to exfiltrate data, then that person's IP address is going to be provided to everybody else. And if it can be identified as a particular person's, that's too bad. They should probably not be exfiltrating data from other people's computers.
So you don't think it's a waste of money?
Well, if it's necessary to satisfy you and shove you aside to get 70 senators to vote for it, I'll take the deal.
Okay. It's pretty good for a lunchtime debate. Sounds more like a bar debate.
So that's a good transition point for the technology aspects of this, of these issues. A question for both of you would be, what technical measures could promote the benefits of big data while also minimizing the privacy risks? You know, Marc, you talk about we have data on things like weather patterns and other things that we collect, data about people, and data that's sort of caught in the middle of all those, such as smartphone data that produces location data. So there's issues about being able to de-identify people. Is the technology capable of protecting our privacy?
So 2 points here. One, I think we can, when we're talking about big data, put the data sets across a spectrum and make some assessment as to the privacy risk. There's a lot of climate data out there, which is enormously useful to NOAA and others, and I haven't heard any dolphins yet complaining about their privacy rights. It might still happen, but I think when we're talking about that type of data, we really don't have to worry about privacy. Of course, data that's linked to the identity of a unique individual, and the classic example, of course, being the Social Security number, almost by definition raises privacy concerns in the big data environment. In fact, you could argue that the Privacy Act of 1974, the most sweeping privacy law that we have in the United States, was based largely out of concern that the Social Security number would end up linking together all government records into a single national profile. So we have a very long tradition in this country of opposing those systems of national identification. Then, of course, you get into this very interesting middle space. You know, I mean, your phone is closely associated with you, but it's not exactly you. So it's, you know, revealing a lot of data about you, and obviously there are privacy concerns there. But just this week, in comments to the FAA, Epic took a new position, which may, you know, Stewart may agree with. I don't know. It'd be a bit odd, actually. But the FAA raised the question whether there should be registration requirements for drones in the United States. And we had a long conversation about this. It was really interesting. I mean, we're anti-identification as a general matter. And so you ask the question, where do the drones fall? Are they more like the Social Security number, or is it more like the climate data? And we actually decided that registration of autonomous devices like drones and robots was a really good idea to establish accountability, because drones and robots like dolphins don't have privacy rights. So that's where we ended up putting the drones. And you'll actually find out tomorrow in a bit of rapid rulemaking what the FAA decides to do on that issue.
Yeah, we may agree on that.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, don't worry, it won't happen again.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it is interesting. In fact, there was a case, if I remember right, in the European Union where they were keeping track of schools of fish and had to stop because the fishermen who were following the schools of fish were having their catch data re-identified to them, and so they objected to having people know where they went to go fishing and how many fish they caught. And under European privacy law, that was personal data and had to be dropped from future studies. So
I get the sense you don't agree with that opinion.
I thought it was silly. So I'm with you. I don't think the dolphin have privacy rights. So all of that, it seems to me, is worth thinking about. But as a practical matter, the lesson of big data is re-identification is just one more database away. It's just not that hard to re-identify people. And so you are, the effort to de-identify is an effort to say, I can do this, but I won't. And because it's a rule that is simply saying, I won't let you have access to the data for any purpose, I think it's wrong. We would be better off saying, we're going to watch for people who are gaining access to this data and using it for a purpose we all agree is inappropriate, rather than saying nobody gets to see it for any purpose.
Okay. Let's talk in the time we have left. There's another debate taking place in the building behind us, which has to do with a deadline coming up at the end of this month, which is on NSA metadata collection and storage. Some say that they want to extend it for, I guess, several years because of the current threat coming from Paris and elsewhere. Where do you both stand on that?
Well, that's a really interesting debate, and this is actually one that Stewart and I have had over the last few years. I will say, if we break it down between the so-called 215 program, which is the collection of domestic telephone records, and the 702 program, which is primarily targeted to non-U.S. persons, I think there is simply on the 215 side very little evidence that the program actually worked. In other words, we didn't even get to the point where we had to engage in that balance of, how much privacy are we prepared to trade off for greater government surveillance, because after loads and loads of hearings and scrutiny and independent review, the conclusion really seemed to be it just didn't lead to any significant information that prevented a terrorist attack. Now, of course, you can always say, as I think some of the dissenters did in the P Club report, that doesn't tell us what might still happen in the future. But that is literally a blank check. I mean, that is literally saying, go ahead, do whatever you want. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work, because we can conceive of some scenario where it might have some value. And I think we really have to be able to say in those situations, that's just not enough. So at least one test when we're talking about privacy and big data, where the privacy interest is on the table and someone is saying, you need to give up some privacy if you want to, have safety or security, is at least show us that this works. At least show us what we're getting in return. Because if there's nothing that you can provide, then it just looks like a very bad deal.
So I've been saying for the last couple of years that, and I agree, there were very few cases that were broken by the 215 program. But that's because the program was very carefully designed to deal with one problem, which was a safe haven where terrorists could recruit and train and plan for a major operation, send people to the United States, and have them carry it out as a conspiracy. And we expected that sooner or later those guys would find themselves having to communicate once or twice back with their overseas sponsors in ways that would allow us to detect them. And if we were quick enough, we could detect them calling home and then immediately map the social graph of the people that they were in touch with in the United States so we could bring the plot to an end. Now, 6 months of starting that program, we had wiped out the principal safe haven for terrorists that existed in Afghanistan. And so for the rest of the next dozen years, there wasn't much in the way of threats similar to the one that this program was designed to deal with. The irony here is that in the last year or two, there has been such a safe haven, and now we know that that safe haven is being used to train terrorists who will be sent to the West to carry out attacks. And so in the very month in which we're getting rid of that program, we have evidence in Paris of why you might want to have a mechanism for identifying exactly that plot. So it does seem to me that there is a reason to keep this. The other thing that's worth talking about is the way in which I think this debate, the debate over the 215 program, has harmed what are some of the best modern tools for preventing abuse of information. The reason we collected all that data was not so that anybody could look at it. Nobody looked at it. It was so that it could be put in a single database and quickly searched. As soon as we saw a call to a particular terrorist number, we could say, does that call come from the United States? One check to see if there was somebody calling that number from the United States, but you needed all the numbers making calls in the United States. You needed access to those to know for sure. And then to match the social graph, you needed a mechanism for integrating that data over multiple carriers' billing systems. And yes, you could imagine designing a program that does that while in a federated way. It's far, far easier to do it in a single database. Recognizing that that was a big deal, and from a privacy point of view, an enormous number of safeguards were put on who could actually access that. It was accessed on average for 300 or to 500 suspicious calls a year. The debate over that, saying, oh, that's unconstitutional, that's illegal, just collecting it is bad, we don't care that you have all these controls, we don't believe them, we're not interested in them, I think has set back the people who do big data analysis quite a ways, because the whole point of big data has to have a lot of data and then to control how you're using it. And I think the debate over 215, which isn't quite done, has really hurt the cause of practical privacy.
Well, I'm going to take issue with that. I mean, among other things, EPIC was actually the group that brought the first challenge to the 215 program. And our argument was actually fairly narrow. We didn't make the big constitutional Fourth Amendment claim. What we simply said was that the court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which issued this order to the Verizon telephone company for all of its customer records, including for domestic telephone communication, simply did not have the legal authority from Congress when it enacted the Patriot Act, the Section 215, because to imagine that a court could tell a U.S. company, turn over all the records of all of your customers, basically required concluding that all of their customers were related to an ongoing investigation. And that was the language in the provision of the Patriot Act. Now, this is actually where I think the big data debate gets most interesting. And again, I have a bit of a background in computer science, so I'm not unsympathetic to the attraction of big data. If you have no legal rules, right, you know, the more the better. You just have more to work with, and more is usually better. And then the question becomes, but what if you need some legal rules? You know, what if you're concerned about the misuse of data? What if you have, you know, everybody's personal information? What if a different government is no longer using the scenario that Stewart just described, which is the safe house in Yemen making the call to San Diego or whatever it was, trying to instrument a terrorist attack? Maybe it's, you know, the political dissident in New York City who's opposing a very draconian political leader in charge in the country, trying to communicate with political allies to organize a domestic protest in Washington. I mean, you have in place, in effect, the exact same data to do the exact same thing that you imagined yourself doing in the first scenario to stop the terrorist attack, now in aid of suppressing political opposition within your own country. And in fact, we know from experience that data has been used this way by very bad governments. Now, I am actually sympathetic to the argument that the people who put the program together really did, in fact, build in a lot of safeguards. And it's always very important to be able to distinguish between systems of big data that have those safeguards and systems of big data. I'm thinking like of the PASS system in South Africa, you know, very famous database from the 70s and 80s that was used largely to maintain the system of apartheid in South Africa. So what sets these two systems apart? And I think part of the answer is legal rules. You know, it's constitutional safeguards. It's the stuff that sometimes does get in the way of the big data scientists, because we happen to live in a democracy, which is kind of a cool thing, and we don't want to be living in another kind of country where the government says, hey, all this data would be really good, we don't want any legal constraints.
This is where he gets his reputation for being against electricity. The fact is that you could say the same thing about South Africa's electrical grid. It was used to run offices that ran apartheid. But the fact is the electrical grid is just a way of providing power, and whether it's used properly or not is a matter of how it's used, not whether you make it available. And to say we don't want this data available because it might be misused is to say, well, maybe they shouldn't have electrical power either out at NSA. The fact is that if you don't want to see it abused, you have to adopt controls, because after all, this data, it's not like it disappears into the ether. It's still sitting in all of the phone company databases. And if you are willing to posit a government that is determined to crack down on dissent in some illegal fashion, it's sort of hard to imagine that they would say, oh, we're going to go hit those people because of their dissents, but oh, we're not going to serve an order on a phone company. Well, that would be bad. They're going to do that too. So you're not really creating an effective check on government by insisting that the government be unable to use data today for a good purpose because it might be misused in the future.
All right, well, let me follow up on this, and this is a topic I think you wanted to get to anyway. So I'm even willing to mostly agree, partly agree. I mean, you know, there are a lot of safeguards in place, and that's significant. But even, you know, the most brilliant people with the best of intentions do make mistakes. And I'm thinking to myself about the folks over at OPM who somehow managed to allow the breach of 20, and everyone here is like nodding, right? I mean, raise your hand if you have a record at OPM. Come on, don't be shy about this. Next question, by the way, how many of you have actually received a breach notification? That's a little more than I expected, but that's because you're here in Washington, so maybe you get a little better treatment. But really, let's keep the OPM example on the table when we're talking about the wonders of big data, right? It is a risk. It is a risk, even in a very sophisticated, well-organized, you know, modern agency, that they will simply...
We're talking OPM here.
All right, well, I'll pull back a little bit on that, but meet me partway, okay?
Yes, okay.
But you know, look, I mean, the numbers are interesting, and what's interesting to me, by the way, it's not just, I mean, I know it's 21.5 million people. It's also 5 million automated fingerprints, digitized fingerprints. That's significant, by the way, because of course we've had this big rush to biometric identification in response to concerns about identity theft. And now, as we've warned in the past, you have this turtles problem where when you create one system to solve one problem, the system you just created itself becomes vulnerable. That's a lesson we should take away from the OPM data breach. They lost control of the biometrics. And another key point for us, it was actually a case we were involved in the Supreme Court, concerned the background investigation form SF-86, right? That's all the very sensitive stuff. You know, they're asking about your medical history, psychological history, drug use, what your neighbors have said about you. All that stuff goes into your background investigation form, the SF-86. And we were actually involved in a case involving scientists working for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for NASA, basically arguing that those forms were too intrusive. And this case goes to the Supreme Court in 2012, and they were arguing that the government is just asking for too much because, as they said, and we agreed, the government actually can't protect the data it's gathering. And that's exposing government employees and contractors to undue risk. And we had lots and lots of evidence. We were amici in that case, lots and lots of evidence of that particular problem. In fact, with NASA, there had been 3 breaches at NASA of their data as this case was going forward. And we said to the court, they're absolutely right. You need to recognize what's called informational privacy, sort of limits on the collection use of personal data. Well, you know how Justice Scalia viewed that claim. He described informational privacy as, quote, a stalking apparition from a Hitchcock movie. I think he was. I think he wasn't too impressed, and Justice Alito, who wrote the opinion for the court, kind of ducked the issue. But we were entirely right. I mean, I really do believe that, and I think the OPM breach demonstrated that in the big data context, the collection of personal data, particularly sensitive data, as in the SF-86 example, really should have been limited. But, you know, it didn't happen, and now we're living with that.
And you could say the same thing, to return to my theme, about electricity. If you have an electrical grid, it can be hacked. And if it's hacked, you could be seriously disadvantaged by having the grid. But that does not mean you say, oh, let's give up on the electricity. If the data is valuable, you need to protect it, but you cannot say, I'm just not going to collect it.
But what if you can't? I mean, this is sort of the reality. And on the electrical thing, while we're not against electricity, I would, however, warn people that this whole Internet of Things, I mean, yeah, big upside. We all get it. You know, you're talking to your thermostat as you walk in, raise the temperature. Oh, isn't that cool? But, you know, someone outside the house hacks your wireless network, and they're raising the temperature. So maybe it's not so cool. Well, it's not cool under either scenario, now that I think about it. But the larger point is that, you know, these new innovations do create new vulnerabilities. And I think we have to think about these new vulnerabilities, you know, very purposefully before we build them in, because your friends in China are looking for them, right?
I think we do agree on this, notwithstanding the temptation for me to shout, get off of my lawn at you. There are risks, then we have to appreciate them for adopting these new technologies, and they're going to show up in odd places and odd ways, and the Internet of Things for sure is going to be a hacking magnet that we all need to worry about.
So this is the point of our debate where we get audience participation. If you have a question for one of the candidates. Anybody?
Yeah, I
Yes.
have an issue with all this. Not only was I in the OPM breach, but the Target breach, the Home Depot breach, also somebody hacked into Amazon and got my credit card information, charged $100 on that. Then within a short time frame after that, my PayPal account was hacked into. The person, whoever did it, got my credit card and charged onto that, and then took money out of my bank account because PayPal likes to have your bank account associated with it. So there's multiple points where my data is out of my hands, and I can't do anything about it. Yeah, I can make great passwords up as an IT person. I can shred all my paper documents and everything, but I'm really concerned about my data. How do we stop this beyond just giving somebody, say, 12 to 18 months worth of credit protection? I mean, it seems ridiculous that my identity can be completely taken from me with all of these breaches. It's not just one breach that's happening, it's multiple ones. What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you pretty much have the ID theft bingo there from the OPM, the Target. Just hold it up, because you're obviously a winner. I'm just going to say. Well, you know, this is one of the big arguments we've been making against big data, which is that there's huge risk. And the problem is that a lot of the organizations that are amassing the data are not the ones that live with the downside when they screw up. You know, it's the people whose information they've collected and lost control of who bear the consequences, which is why what most of modern privacy law tries to do is put back the responsibility on the organization to protect the data it collects. And quite frankly, if you can't protect it, you don't collect it. I mean, it's almost that simple. The consequences, you know, of getting this wrong, I think, you know, we live with them on a daily basis. The FTC says identity theft has been the #1 concern of American consumers going back 15 years, which is remarkable. But instead of acting on the problem, companies just collect more and more data. I think that has to change.
So I'm not
Vote
sure.
for me.
Exactly. I'm not going to completely disagree, but I will try to disagree some. First, it does make sense to put the cost of the breach on the people who are in a position to stop the breach. And the good news there is that there are, you know, every time somebody sends you a notice saying, by the way, we had a data breach with your data, you are almost automatically enrolled in a class action lawsuit against the retailer. The bad news is those cases get settled for somewhere around $2 a head, so it's not going to cost them that much. It doesn't cost you that much either, except in hassle, but it's probably more than $2 worth of hassle. The good news on top of that, though, is that banks are increasingly upset to find themselves in a position of having to reissue cards. And so we've seen remarkably banks bring class actions of banks against the retailers saying, you may settle those claims for $2 when you're dealing with the consumers, but with us it's going to be $50 a head because that's what it costs us to reissue a card. So the penalties for screwing up here are substantial, and this is leading to increasingly companies not keeping your card numbers, but keeping some token that designates the fact that there was an authorized transaction against your card, and all they have is a number that's good for one transaction. I am confident that the retailers who will never have good cybersecurity are all going to move in that direction. Can't help you with PayPal, though.
I learned a lot though with it. I learned one thing: don't associate a bank account with either Amazon or PayPal. And if you did, make a separate bank account. So I had to get a new bank account because of it. And another thing I found out is that there are a lot of people running through Target and stuff that have those scanners and are taking your information. And I actually have those little cards, that you put in your
A little Faraday card.
those little things, but they don't work well because in May, 2 of my credit cards got hacked while I was in Target. So
Everybody at that table may want to
Yeah,
move
exactly.
away
You just
slowly.
step back.
I don't think I'm jinxed, but what I think is that I'm learning an incredible amount about how our data is so vulnerable, and I've taken a lot of steps of my own to stop it. So no bank account on PayPal or Amazon, no credit cards ever being saved on any of these places, and getting those sleeves that actually really do work. Is the cards that you have, like one in the front, one in the back, in between your credit cards in between all that. Those ones don't work, but the ones that are with the sleeves do.
So the only thing that stands between you and the total meltdown actually is big data, because Visa and MasterCard have massive, sophisticated back-end transaction review systems that are designed to find examples of misuse of the computers, of the credit card, so that they can shut down the card quickly. And PayPal has, the guys from PayPal have said to me, we used to have 50 competitors, but it turned out the crooks put all of them out of business, and that's how we survived, because we had better fraud detection than anybody else, and a lot of that is big data as well.
We got time for one more, and candidates, I have to limit you to 60-second responses,
Got it.
please.
I thought this was a fascinating conversation, and despite your I thought this was a fascinating conversation, and despite your differences, I do commend and respect that I do believe both of you genuinely are coming at this from a perspective of protecting the American people, and you just have different ways of looking at that. So thank you for your efforts in that. How can the American citizens better engage in this debate? Because it is a complicated debate, and we barely probably scratched the surface today. But how does, because it is going to be a nuanced thing, and maybe how we think about it is going to be cultural, and it'll evolve over time. How can people engage in this conversation more?
Well, I would say fill out some of those ID theft credit repair forms, but that's not the answer you want. You know, my organization, EPIC, was established over 20 years ago, and our aim was to focus, as we said, public attention on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues. And that's still what we do. And I would encourage you to visit our website, which is epic.org. You know, this week we were working on drone registration. We had someone yesterday testify at a House hearing regarding connected vehicles, right? It's really an interesting privacy question when your car becomes internet enabled, not only for privacy, but also for safety. And we're involved in a dispute with the FAA about drone privacy and some other things. So there's a lot of stuff happening out there. And I certainly do think it's a good idea to take steps to protect your privacy, but I'm actually against becoming a privacy survivalist. It worries me, you know. I mean, people are going to move down into their basements, and they're going to, like, you're already doing it, aren't you? This woman in front is going, she's already moved down. She's got the bed there, she's got the, you know, black, you know, everything, that's fine. But my point is, you know, we should be able to take advantage of technology. We should be able to use the internet. We should be able to, you know, enjoy innovation, but it has to be done in a way that ensures safety and security and reliability, and that's the big challenge. And we can't wish it away. We've got to focus on solving those problems.
So very quickly, the people who are willing to sacrifice a lot of security, who are determined to protect their privacy at all costs against even theoretical government risks, are, it turns out, very well represented in both parties. They are part of the base of both parties, probably because when the other party has control of the government, they know that they're just this close to dictatorship. The rest of us who think that, in fact, there are reasons why government does the things it does, and that there are important security values that ought to be protected, don't get hurt as much. And so to the extent that you feel that way about a particular issue, make sure your congressman hears from you, because he's for sure hearing from the nutcases of his party.
Please help me and thank Stewart Baker and Marc Rotenberg. Thanks very much.
Thank you.